Luke chapter 19, please. My oldest son and wife Ashley and all grandchildren are here today. And hi. So there's no telling what might happen. Luke 19. This is a very familiar story. You know what happens with some stories that you're so familiar with, that you've sung about them in Sunday school, is that there's an old saying that says, with familiarity breeds what? So you can hear me read this story and go, oh, okay, I know this story. And we've been studying passages in the Gospel of Luke this summer, the last part of the summer, to just try to understand what it means when Jesus comes into our heart. He opens our heart and He opens our hands. And we're going to see that, I think, played out very profoundly this morning in the life of Zacchaeus. Last week we looked at what it means when Jesus comes in and we are now ministers. We have a purpose. And the week before that we looked at hospitality, that there is no one who's ever been born on this planet that doesn't deserve to have you and I to share a meal with. Today we're going to look at what happens when a man's heart is changed when God finds him. Luke 19. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man named Zacchaeus, and was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, he is gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner. Well, Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much. Then Jesus said to him, today, salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and save the lost. This is God's word. Before I start the sermon, I just want to ask a couple of questions of you to see if this is going to be a relevant topic for us this morning. So if any of these apply to you, just make a mental note, okay? Have you ever gossiped about anyone to anyone? Anybody here ever do any self-promotion? Anyone here ever get judgmental towards anyone? Anyone here ever bend the truth just a little to make yourself look better than you really are? Anyone here ever get impatient? Or hold a grudge? Or think about money way too much? Anybody in this room have any bad habits? Now, if you said yes to any of those, or you're sitting next to someone who might have said yes to one of those, would you raise your hand? Oh, good. Then this is going to land with some of you. None of us are perfect people. Would you agree to that? None of us are perfect people. You're sitting next to someone who's imperfect. Of course, you knew that, right? None of us are perfect, including this preacher. We are all a wreck. We are all a mess. We are a work in progress. Now, we start out pretty good, a little noisy, but pretty good. But none of us are living lives that God intended for any of us to live. But He takes the mess of our lives, it's what He has to work with, and He fashions something out of us. Now, we get wrecked along the way. I have. We get wrecked by our own sin. We self-inflict wounds upon ourselves. What's going on in this story of Zacchaeus is that he's a tax collector. Now, for a Jewish man to be a tax collector in that age was a terrible, terrible thing. Tax collectors made their livings by cooperating with the occupying forces, which were the Romans in that time. And they made their money by gouging their fellow citizens. They were traitors. They were cheats. Nobody liked tax collectors. It would be equivalent maybe today of being a drug dealer and setting up house right next door to an elementary school. These were people that were despicable in the eyes of the community. His decision to take advantage of people had shrunk his soul down to the size of a peanut. The only thing that Zacchaeus cared about was money and possessions. And yet, with the acquisition of money and possessions, he was a very miserable man. Would you just agree with me a little bit here that sin wrecks our lives? Choices that we've made, trajectories that we've gone on in our life just wreck our lives. We have addictions, we have anger issues, we have lust issues, we have obsessions, we have pride, we have prejudices, we have a mess on our hands, and that's just the front two pews. We're a mess in this room, aren't we? We're a hot mess in this room. I haven't even gotten to the middle section yet. Sometimes we wreck our own lives. That's what Zacchaeus did by his career choice. Sometimes people wreck our lives. Other people do. Now, Zacchaeus made sinful choices, but other people probably had done some bad towards him. The story points out that he was a short person. Okay? In that part of the world, people of smaller stature would have been looked upon as weak people. That culture, that was a sign of a weakness. So for all of his life, Zacchaeus was probably getting called names, probably getting bullied in school, probably getting shoved in lockers, or whatever the first century equivalent was. Junior high would have been tough for Zacchaeus. Parents who criticize us too much, some of us have had those. Peers who humiliate us, spouses who use us and don't pay attention to us. All of that leaves us lonely, insecure, and afraid. Sometimes we inflict pain upon ourselves and wreck ourselves. Sometimes other people do it to us. And sometimes our lives get wrecked by the circumstances of life. Right? A disease comes. Disabilities we're perhaps born with. You have unemployment. All kinds of things can happen to us in this life because we live in a fallen world that we have no control over. And we get beat up by life. We get wrecked, and as a result, we're not the people that God intended us to be. The promise of Jesus is that He can build the kingdom out of people like us. He can build the kingdom out of people who have the problems that you and I have, the sins that you and I have. He can transform us. He can reconcile us to God. He can do all kinds of things when He comes into our life. He can restore us to become what He intended us to be. So for this story this morning, I want to walk you through. There's two ways that I see that Jesus does this. The first way is that as He travels through the land on His way to Jerusalem, He seeks us, and once He's found us, He sends us out to build His kingdom. He seeks us and He sends us. So it says here that Jesus went looking for Zacchaeus. He noticed him there. Did you see that? He was walking down the street and he looked up and he saw a wee little man in a tree. He saw him. That's pretty powerful. If I have been designated to be the leader of a movement and I'm going into a town, I'm not looking up into trees. I'm looking for the mayor. I'm looking for the city council. I'm looking for the movers and shakers in Jericho. I want to get close to them. That's who I want to be next to, because the movement depends upon this kind of publicity. But I'm not Jesus. Jesus is walking down a crowded street and looks up and sees the most despicable man in all of Jericho and calls him by name. Many years ago, when I was pastoring in the Pacific Northwest, we had a guest pastor come speak at our church, and after that time of ministry in the Word, we followed him down to his ministry field, which was on Aurora Avenue in Shoreline, Washington. And there we saw where this little church plant had gathered for worship. And then we crossed over a covered bridge over a very busy street, Aurora Avenue. And while we were walking down the bridge on the other side, I was walking with the pastor, and we walked beside a woman who was seated on some steps, and it looked like she was eating yogurt and an apple. And the pastor said to me, "You just go on. I want to show you where we reclaimed ground that had once been used by a meth house, and we took over that lot and tore the building down, and now we've created a community garden to feed the people in the community. But it's down the road. Take a left and go down, and I'll be with you in a moment." So the 15 of us decided to do that. And he sat down on the steps beside this woman, right beside her, and looked her in the eyes. And we went on. And right before we could find where the community garden was, we stopped to wait for the pastor. And we waited. And we waited. And we waited some more. And snarky as I am, I said to the people that were there waiting with me, "Doesn't he realize that we are busy people?" And that got about as much laugh as it did right then. And then pretty soon, here he came, walking up the street. And then he led us into the little courtyard that they had transformed from a meth house into a place that had tomatoes and squash and green beans and all kinds of produce. And then he began to talk to us about this. Presently, in walked the woman he had been talking to on those steps. He stopped talking to us. He went over and talked to Doris. That was her name. And after he spoke with Doris just a few moments, he turned to the rest of us and said, "Would any of you mind sharing your Subway plastic sack that you brought your sandwiches in?" And so somebody pulled off one of those plastic sacks and gave it to him. And he and Doris began to pick tomatoes and put them in that bag. And then Doris sat down and ate one of those tomatoes, and he continued to talk with us. Do you know what that pastor was doing? He was noticing. He was seeing invisible people. It was a parable of exactly what Jesus is doing here with Zacchaeus. You know, one of the things I desperately know is true of all of us. We want to be noticed. We want to be seen. We want somebody to see us. There is a whole category of people in this world who feel like they are never seen, never noticed. But when we are noticed by the Son of the living God, it changes us. Have you ever felt unnoticed? You ever felt like that no one knows your name? That's how Zacchaeus felt. Every time he took his tax-collecting, price-gouging, money-grubbing, Roman collaborating self down the street, people would turn the other way as if he were a non-person. He belongs to the enemy. He belongs to that oppressive regime. He belongs on the trash heap, and they would turn away from him. On this day, though, the Son of the living God walks down the street and turns his face right on to Zacchaeus. What did that do to Zacchaeus? Well, I'll tell you what it did. It changed his life. He's not the same. Zacchaeus climbs a tree because he's looking for Jesus, but what he finds out all along is that Jesus had come to Jericho to find him. Verse 5, look what it says. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today. How did Jesus know his name? I don't think they wore name tags back in those days. How do you think Jesus knew Zacchaeus' name? I have no idea. Of course, he's a son of God. He knows everything, right? Or maybe when he got to the outskirts of town, he might have got somebody on the outskirts of town and say, who is the most despicable man in this place? And that's who he came for. Who's the one person no one in this town will have anything to do with? Well, that's who I'm going to go for. Maybe that's what happened. But having noticed, he begins to notice others. When Zacchaeus notices that he's been noticed, he starts to notice others. It's the way of Jesus. Do you know Jesus is always looking for us? And when he looks for us and he finds us and he sees us and he calls us by name, that heals the wounds that are deep inside. Those self-inflicted wounds, those others-inflicted wounds, and those life-inflicted wounds. It starts to heal us. Jesus knows your name, by the way. There's something about that, knowing that he knows your name, that changes you. In spite of all of Zacchaeus' sins, and they were many and they were profound, Jesus forgives him. But not only does Jesus forgive him of some of the most heinous crimes that you could do towards humanity, Jesus says, I'd like to go to your house for a meal. Zacchaeus has been a social leper for years. And now someone of some renown wants to spend a meal with him. Think of the harm that Zacchaeus' greed has done to the poor in Jericho. You think about this. He was no doubt involved in loan sharking. That was common among tax collectors. That means fathers had legs broken because they couldn't pay their tax debt. Zacchaeus had a hand in that. That meant children were sold into slavery because their parents couldn't pay their tax debt. And Zacchaeus would have given his stamp of approval on that. That meant wives and mothers perhaps were prostituting themselves because the family couldn't pay the tax debt. There were bellies that were distended in hunger because this man was padding his pockets with the money that the poor people could not give. But when they did give, he just got wealthier and wealthier. And there were kids with distended bellies all over Jericho because of Zacchaeus. His sins were huge. But Jesus saw him, called his name, and said, I want to have a meal with you today. And that changed Zacchaeus. I came here for you, Zacchaeus. That's what Jesus is saying. Now look what it says in verse 5. It says there that Jesus, it looks like he went specifically to Jericho to find Zacchaeus. Look what it says in verse 5. I must stay at your house. In other words, Jesus is saying, you're why I've come to this town. I didn't come for recreation. I didn't come for entertainment. I didn't come to further my career or my ministry goals. I came here for you, Zacchaeus. You see, it looks to us like Zacchaeus might have been an interruption to a busy ministry of the Son of God. But Jesus lived by a different rhythm. I know you know this. People were never an interruption to Jesus. I love what Henry Nouwen wrote in his book, Reaching Out. He said this, while visiting the University of Notre Dame, where I had been a teacher for a few years, I met an older, experienced professor who had spent most of his life there.
And while we strolled over the beautiful campus, he said with a certain melancholy in his voice, "You know, my whole life I have been complaining that my work was constantly being interrupted until I discovered that the interruptions were my work." Come on. Zacchaeus was the work of Christ, and so are you. God wants to be with you. Did you know that? Do you believe God likes you? You know, some of you are saying, well, I know He loves me because He's God and He has to, but do you believe that God would just as soon spend a day with you as spend a day with anybody else on the planet? He just would like to hang out with you. If you don't think that God actually likes you, then you and I need to have some prayer time together. Because He doesn't just love you because He has to. He likes to spend time with you. So He seeks us. Then He sends us. And one of the ways He sends us is by reminding us who we are and putting us in community with people. I love this in verse 9. Would you look at it with me? Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of who? Of Abraham." He's putting Zacchaeus back into community in Jericho. He's sending notice to Jericho. Welcome this guy back into the family. Yes, he's done despicable things. Yes, he's absolutely been guilty of heinous crimes. But I've seen him. I've called him by name. He's now welcomed back into the family of the covenant people. God does that with us. He puts us around people around us to encourage us, to challenge us, to hold us accountable. It was never Jesus' intention that folks get an eternal card punch to go to heaven and then go to church once a week, hear some music, as good as it is, hear a talk, as long as it is, and then go and live your life any way you choose. That was never Jesus' intention. He intends us to be in community with one another. That's not always easy. I realize that. In general, I'm going to hurry here, but in general, I'll tell you as a pastor, I'm a loner. Let me have my church folks, and I'm pretty content. I don't hang out with other preachers. And the reason is typically preachers have always just creeped me out just a little bit. I'm just being honest with you. They've creeped me out. They posture, they brag. How many are you running in your church these days? How big's your budget? Those kinds of things drive me nuts. They do impression management like they're rock stars. I actually cannot sometimes stand to be around preachers. However, a few years ago, God began to reveal to me that I have a role to play in their lives. I need them to inform me about my vocation as a pastor. And so this is the truth. I began to invite young pastors to have lunch with me or to have coffee with me. I just invite them. You want to get a coffee? You want to get a lunch? I can't tell you how many times that I have been stood up on that invitation. Yes, I want to do that. I'll be there. And then I go to this place and I wait for an hour and they don't show. And I get a text, sorry, I forgot. They're busy. They've got growing churches and growing families, and they don't have time for old preachers. That's when I start to feel unnoticed, unseen. But I stay at it. I don't give up on them. Do you know why? Because they need me. Can you hear me at all? They need me. And do you know what? I need them. I need them. Because there are times I get discouraged and they encourage me. There are times I have no one to talk to about specific issues that only pastors go through, and I can talk with them and they can pray for me. But it's not easy because they're so busy. My point in telling you this is simply this. Don't give up on community. Don't pout that you don't have anybody to talk to. Don't pout and sit there and wish you had a group that you could identify with and you could share your heart with, because you are responsible for your own soul care. And if part of being in soul care is to have other people speak into your lives, then get up and do something about that. Now I have about 8 pastors that call me their pastor. And I have pastors that I call my pastors. But it took a lot of tenacious getting stood up, not knowing where anybody is. Why won't they hang out with me? Did I not take my breath's bad? Or did I post something on Facebook that ticked somebody off? Which is true. It happens all daily. As this scene ends in Zacchaeus' life, Jesus is going off to rejoice at his house. And Zacchaeus starts to build the kingdom. Verse 8, Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I give to the poor. And if I've defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." From a heart full of joy, Zacchaeus makes amends to those whom he had wronged. The people of Jericho couldn't have imagined that this traitor, this loan shark, this leg breaker would have been transformed to have such a generous soul. It blew them away. Ken Geyer wrote a book called The Intimate Moments with the Savior, and in it he describes this amazing transformation. Let me read that to you now. From behind the barriers he has erected around his heart, a flood of repentant feelings bursts forth, feelings that had been dammed up for years. Zacchaeus goes out on still another limb. What took a lifetime to accumulate, one sentence of devotion liquidates. And not by a token 10%, half to the poor, 4-fold to the defrauded. Look closely. Witness the miracle. A camel passing through the eye of a needle. Isn't that good? One of the best ways I know how to get over my own sense of unimportance is to get my eyes off of myself and put them onto someone else. And I think that's why God, in order to restore us and to heal us, calls us to build His kingdom. We're to join Him in that process so that we can get our eyes off of our problems and put them onto someone else. So that we don't look at ourselves, but we look at what Patty mentioned earlier and find ways to get our eyes on other people. Find ways to serve. Jesus brings us His kingdom by seeking us, by forgiving us, by accepting us and putting us around other people and asking us to build that kingdom with Him. And that changes us. It's a little bit like the statue of Michelangelo's David. I think we have a picture of this. Tastefully cropped for church viewing. Many of you have seen this, right? Some of you have seen it in person, I'm guessing, right? A few of you have. 8-9 foot tall, it's huge. Michelangelo, the story behind this is considered to be perhaps the greatest piece of sculpture in the world. But the story behind this is that the stone that he used was rejected by every artist in Italy as being hopelessly flawed. It had cracks, it had blemishes, it had spots. No artist wanted this piece of marble. But Michelangelo took it and he worked on it for 3 years, and when he unveiled it, all the other artists were amazed, and they asked him, "How did you get such a beautiful statue out of such a flawed piece of stone?" And Michelangelo said this, "It was easy. I just looked at the stone and chipped everything away that didn't look like David." That's what God does with us. And what you don't know is that some of you must realize that He uses chips,
He uses a mallet, he uses a chisel, and he chips away at things in you that doesn't look like Jesus. And sometimes that's me. I'm the guy on the hammer. And sometimes that's your spouse hammering away at you. And sometimes that's life hammering away at you. But it's chipping away everything that doesn't look like Jesus. And it takes a long time, but he takes flawed people. We've established that at least the first 3 rows are very flawed. He takes flawed pieces of marble to make something beautiful. And so, Mountain Heights Baptist Church, how is he chipping you so that you can become everything he created you to be, everything he imagined you could be? How can you participate in that chipping so that his kingdom will come in you and into Chaffee County? Because if you're very quiet this morning, we might just hear the soft sound of sandaled feet in this place. And he might stop right beside your pew and call your name. And when he does, that changes everything. We love you, Jesus. I'm grateful that you are a noticer of those of us who feel like we have gone too far, that we are unimportant, that you know every one of our names. I'm so grateful. Now, would you do a deeper work in this pastor? Would you show me where I have gouged people, where I have withheld grace from people? Would you show me where I have prejudged people? Would you call me by name? Would you come to my house for dinner? Would you change me? I don't live in Jericho, I live in Buena Vista. But would you do such a change in me that the people of Buena Vista will be surprised at the grace and the transformation? And use whoever you need to use, Lord, to chip away at everything in me that doesn't remind you of your Son.